Welcome to Lovescape, where every heartbeat hides a secret and every secret can destroy an entire empire. Tonight, you're not just listening to a story, you're stepping into a storm that swallowed my life whole. A storm created by a man who believed power could rewrite destiny, and that fear could force loyalty. This is the night everything changed, the night I learned that silence can be a prison and courage can be a weapon sharper than any blade. It started like any ordinary evening. The kind of evening where the world feels slow, predictable, almost comforting. The streetlights flickered above me as I walked home from the small bookstore where I worked. My shoes were worn, my body tired, but there was something peaceful about the routine. I remember humming softly to myself, counting the little coins from my shift tips, wondering if I had enough for a hot chocolate. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, simple, quiet, safe. Or so I thought. Everything changed when I heard the low rumble of engines behind me. Not one engine, two. Deep, heavy, synchronized like predators stalking prey. I turned, expecting to see taxis or delivery trucks, but instead, two massive black SUVs slid to a stop beside me. Windows tinted pitch black. No plates I could see. No movement inside. Just silence, the kind of silence that suffocates. My heart kicked against my ribs. 1,000 possibilities flashed in my mind: kidnapping, robbery, human trafficking. I told myself to run, but my legs froze like they had turned to stone. The back door of the first SUV opened slowly, almost deliberately, as if whoever was inside wanted me to feel the suspense, the fear, the uncertainty. And then he appeared. Adrian Knight. The billionaire. The golden boy of the media. The man whose face was plastered on magazine covers, and whose charity events filled headlines. The world adored him, but sitting inside that SUV, he looked nothing like the charming public figure millions worshipped. His expression was cold enough to freeze fire. His jaw was tight, his suit too perfect, his eyes empty like he had traded his soul for power a long time ago. He didn't step out. He didn't gesture politely. He simply tilted his head and said, "Get in." Not a request. Not an invitation. A command. Something in the way he spoke sent a shiver through me, a subtle message that if I didn't comply, the consequences would come fast and without mercy. Against every instinct screaming inside me, I got in. The door shut behind me like a vault ceiling shut. Inside the car, the scent of expensive leather mixed with Adrian's cologne, sharp, clean, intimidating. He stared at me not like a person, but like a solution to a crisis he needed to control. His gaze moved from my face to my trembling hands, and he actually smirked, as if my fear amused him. Then he said the words that shattered the floor beneath my life. "I need you to marry me. Tonight." I stared at him, thinking I misheard. I waited for a punchline, a camera crew, anything to make sense of the insanity. My voice came out small and shaky as I whispered, "I'm sorry, what?" His expression didn't change. "My reputation is under attack. A scandal is about to surface. I need a clean, innocent wife beside me before the headlines break." I blinked, convinced this had to be a nightmare. "Why me? You don't even know me." He leaned forward, his voice lowering like a threat wrapped in silk. "Oh, I know everything about you." He slid a folder across the seat. My hands trembled as I opened it, and my stomach dropped. There were photos of me leaving work, entering my apartment, grocery shopping, talking to my landlord, sitting alone at a cafe. Pages of printed text with details about my family, my workplace, my finances, even the time I usually wake up. My blood went cold. I felt stripped, violated, exposed. I wasn't just a stranger, I had been a target. He tilted his head and said almost casually, "You were chosen because your life is quiet. Clean. Uncomplicated. Easily managed. Managed. Like I was a pet, or a property, not a human being." He continued, "If you refuse, I can ruin you in minutes. Your landlord will evict you. Your job will disappear. Your bank account will freeze. Everything you rely on, gone." He didn't blink. "And no one will believe you over me." A wave of nausea hit me. I felt the walls of the SUV closing in, turning into a cage. I tried to breathe, but every breath felt sharper than the last, like I was inhaling glass. I whispered, barely audible, "Why would you do this?" Adrian's lips curved into a cold smile. "Because I can." He straightened his cuffs like he was making casual small talk. "Sign the papers, and you'll live a comfortable life. Disobey, and your life will burn before the night ends." His arrogance was staggering. His confidence terrifying. And in that moment, I realized something chilling: he had already decided my fate. My choices were illusions. Options meant to create the appearance of freedom when none existed. As the SUV started moving toward the courthouse, my mind spun in 1,000 directions. Fear, anger, disbelief, helplessness, all swirling into one overwhelming storm. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. I wanted to fight. But I was trapped, physically, mentally, emotionally. The city lights blurred past the window, and I saw my reflection, pale, terrified, small. I barely recognized myself. My life wasn't mine anymore. I was stepping into a prison disguised as marriage, tied to a man who valued reputation over humanity. Cliffhanger for Part 2. And yet, in that moment of utter powerlessness, a small spark ignited inside me, a whisper, a promise, a vow. If he wanted a wife, he would get one. But he had no idea I would become the one thing he could never control, the reason his empire would crumble. The courthouse door shut behind us with a hollow thud that echoed far longer than it should have, like the building itself was mourning what had just happened inside. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, humming faintly, casting an unflattering glow across the empty hallway. It felt like walking through the spine of a beast, cold, rigid, and alive in a way that made my skin crawl. My steps were shaky, uneven, hesitant, while Adrian's were firm and precise, each one landing like a stamp of ownership. There was no pause, no hesitation, no moment of reflection on the life he had just taken from me. That indifference hurt more than the fear itself. It told me exactly how worthless my autonomy was to him. I kept thinking maybe someone, anyone, would appear out of a corner, ask what was going on, question why a billionaire CEO was dragging a terrified girl into a courthouse in the middle of the night. But the corridors stayed empty, silent, indifferent. The universe didn't care. The walls didn't care. No one cared. The judge who officiated the marriage had given me a look, half pity, half helplessness, but he didn't intervene. No one intervened. And that realization was crushing, as if the last bit of safety I believed existed in the world dissolved right there under the harsh lights. The signing of the marriage papers was supposed to be the moment that sealed my fate, but strangely, it wasn't. The moment that stayed with me was the look Adrian gave the judge afterward, a brief, sharp nod of satisfaction. A nod that said, "This is good. This is handled. This problem is solved." I wasn't a newlywed to him. I wasn't a partner. I wasn't even a person. I was a tool he had acquired, like a contract signed under duress, like a shield forged out of desperation. And the way he slid his phone into his pocket afterward, already moving on to the next thing, made it clear he expected me to do the same, to follow, to obey, to give up any illusion of resistance. When we stepped outside, the night felt colder than before. The wind bit at my skin, tugging at my hair, reminding me I was still alive even though it felt like I had been buried. The city was quiet at that hour, but not peaceful, more like it was holding its breath. The courthouse steps stretched out beneath my feet, and every step I took down them felt like walking into a future I never chose. The black SUV, the same one that had taken away my freedom, sat waiting like a loyal dog, engine humming softly. Its tinted windows reflected my face back at me, but I barely recognized the girl in the glass. She looked hollow-eyed, shattered, lost. A girl who had stepped out of her life and into someone else's nightmare. Adrian didn't offer a hand to help me into the car. He didn't look at me at all. He simply climbed in from his side, assuming, as always, that I would get in behind him. And the shame of it burned. It shouldn't have. I hadn't done anything wrong. But humiliation has a way of seeping into your bones even when you know you're the victim. I slid into the seat, the door closing with a dull, suffocating click. It felt final. It felt like the world shrinking down into a metal box moving through the darkness. Inside the SUV, the silence was unbearable. I could hear my heart pounding, hear my breath uneven. Adrian typed on his phone with the calmness of a man checking stock prices instead of forcing a woman into marriage. His fingers moved across the screen with cold precision, and every tap felt like another reminder that he was already planning his next steps without considering mine. The security guards in the front seats remained expressionless, trained not to notice anything beyond their job. Their lack of reaction made the entire situation feel even more surreal, like kidnapping and forced marriage were just another Tuesday night assignment. At one point, the SUV passed under a streetlight, and the brief flare of illumination revealed the shadows under Adrian's eyes. He didn't look tired, he looked stressed, preoccupied, like a man juggling a dozen invisible fires. That's when I realized something crucial and unsettling: this marriage wasn't about me at all. I wasn't the cause, I was the cover. There was a much bigger storm behind him, one he was desperately trying to outrun. And if he was willing to drag a stranger into the flames just to shield himself, then whatever he was hiding was monstrous. I turned my head toward the window again, watching the city blur past. My reflection in the glass looked fragile, but behind the fragility was something else, something sharp. There was a spark of rebellion forming, the very beginning of a boundary I didn't even know I had. Fear was still there, a heavy, choking presence in my chest, but underneath it, deep in the place where survival instinct lives, something else was beginning to bloom. Anger. Quiet, simmering, dangerous anger. Not the kind that explodes, but the kind that watches, learns, waits. I whispered under my breath, so low no one could hear. Something is wrong with him, and I'm going to find out what. Right then, Adrian's phone buzzed, and his expression changed instantly. The confidence drained from his face for a split second before he schooled it back into cold composure. But that 1 second, that one flash of fear, told me everything. He wasn't invincible. He wasn't in full control. He wasn't the untouchable billionaire the world saw. He was hiding something. Something big. Something dangerous. Something that could destroy him faster than any scandal. And for the first time since this nightmare began, a strange thought crossed my mind, one that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. Maybe I wasn't as powerless as he thought. Maybe, just maybe, I could use his secret against him. The night everything shifted began quietly, eerily quiet, the kind of silence that creeps under your skin and warns you that something is about to break. I had been living in his mansion for months by then, surrounded by marble floors, polished staircases, and chandeliers that sparkled like frozen lightning. But even with all that luxury around me, I felt like a prisoner dressed in silk. I moved through the house like a ghost, unnoticed, unacknowledged, barely tolerated. He had forced me into marriage to protect his name, his business, his spotless reputation. And yet, he barely looked at me unless he needed to control something, my schedule, my conversations, the way I smiled in front of his associates. But on this night, something inside me refused to stay silent. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was anger. Maybe it was the slow, burning realization that if I didn't fight back now, I never would. Earlier that day, I had overheard something, an argument between him and his business partner behind a half-closed office door. His voice was low, dangerous, simmering with panic. The partner's voice trembled. They spoke about numbers that didn't add up, deals that were collapsing, and investors who were threatening to pull out. My husband, the man who had lectured me about power and control, was losing everything. It wasn't just a crack in his empire, it was a fracture spreading fast, a slow-motion collapse he was trying desperately to hide. And when I heard him say, "No one can know, not even her," something snapped inside me. Because after everything he'd done to me, after the humiliation, the manipulation, the way he stole my life to protect his own reputation, he still saw me as an outsider. He still didn't trust me. He still treated me like a problem instead of a partner. That was the moment I decided I'd stop being silent. Even if it cost me everything. When dinner came, he sat across from me at the long dining table, pretending everything was normal. He spoke about business events, charity galas, and public appearances, as if the walls weren't closing in on him. As if I couldn't see the tension in his jaw or the way his fingers trembled slightly when he lifted his glass. He looked at me with a polished smile, the kind he used in photographs, the kind strangers believed. It was a mask he had worn so long that he didn't realize how transparent it had become. I stared at him for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until I saw confusion flicker in his eyes. Finally, he set down his fork and asked why I was looking at him like that. And that's when I said it, because you're lying. And you're running out of places to hide. His expression froze. For a second, he didn't even blink. Then the mask cracked. His voice sharpened, his posture stiffened, and he demanded to know what I thought I knew. But the more angry and defensive he became, the more calm I felt. For the first time since the forced marriage, I wasn't scared of him. I wasn't trying to survive him. I was watching him unravel, piece by piece, lie by lie. He slammed his fist against the table, plates rattling as he shouted that his empire was fine, that I was overstepping, that I had no right to question him. But I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. Because I knew. And he knew that I knew. And that terrified him more than any investor or scandal ever could. When he stormed out of the dining room, slamming the door behind him, I didn't follow. I walked upstairs slowly, with a calm I hadn't felt in months. I went to his office, his fortress, and I opened his drawers, his cabinets, his files. I wasn't snooping for curiosity. I was looking for the truth. And the truth was worse than I imagined. There were documents hidden behind fake panels, confidential reports buried under legal papers, and photos tucked into envelopes sealed with his initials. Photos of meetings, transactions, illegal deals, bribes, and evidence of crimes he had covered with money and threats. His entire empire wasn't built on power, it was built on lies. And in that moment, I realized something so shocking that I had to sit down because my legs couldn't hold me. He didn't marry me to protect his reputation. He married me to silence me. Because if I ever spoke, his empire would collapse. My hands trembled as I flipped through the documents. Every page was another betrayal. Every photo another sin. Every signature another reminder of how deeply he had buried his corruption. I felt sick. Heartbroken. Furious. But above all, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, clarity. He thought he could control me forever. He thought I was weak. He thought I would remain silent and obedient, a decorative wife with no power. But he didn't know what kind of woman he married. He forced me into this marriage to save himself, and he never expected that one day, I would be the one standing over the ruins of everything he built. And as I sat there in the dim glow of his office lamp, surrounded by the evidence of his crimes, I whispered a single sentence to myself, one that would become the turning point of my life. He took everything from me, and now, I will take everything from him. And that night? That was the night his empire truly began to crumble, the first crack in his armor. The next morning, the mansion didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a battlefield disguised in velvet and marble. I woke up with the kind of heaviness in my chest that comes from knowing too much, like an entire truth was lodged beneath my ribs, pressing against my lungs every time I tried to breathe. The silence of the room was almost hostile, the kind that doesn't comfort you but instead reminds you that you're alone, trapped, and being watched by things you can't see. The sun hadn't fully risen yet, but a pale light seeped through the curtains, stretching across the polished floors and illuminating the corners where monsters hide, not real monsters, but the metaphorical kind, the ones living in human skin. I moved slowly, my mind replaying the previous night over and over, his hidden files, the lies he built his empire on, the secrets he thought were buried beyond anyone's reach. My fingers, even now, tingled as though they were still brushing over the glossy folders in his office. And my heartbeat pulsed louder the closer I got to the staircase, like a drum warning me not to go any further. Yet I kept walking. Because fear wasn't my chain anymore. It was my compass. It was guiding me, not holding me back. When I reached the bottom floor, he was already there. He was pacing the foyer like someone had replaced his blood with gasoline. His movements were sharp, erratic, restless, like he expected something to explode but didn't know where the spark would come from. The moment he spotted me, he froze mid-step. His eyes locked onto me with this wild, searching intensity, as if he was trying to read my thoughts by force. For a brief moment, the air between us felt electrically charged, heavy with paranoia. He knew something was off. He just didn't know how much. He asked where I had gone the night before, but his voice wasn't neutral, it cracked at the edges. He sounded like a man who had just realized the cage door wasn't locked anymore. And instead of answering directly, I responded with a simple question, why does it matter? Those 4 words hit him like a slap. His face shifted instantly, confusion, irritation, fear, all blending together into something he didn't know how to hide. For the first time, he wasn't the one leading the conversation. He wasn't the one dictating the rules. I watched his composure crumble silently, like a statue developing fractures under heat. He stepped closer, lowering his voice in that cold, controlled tone he reserved for intimidation. He accused me of being emotional, unstable, overreacting. He tried to convince me that I was imagining things, twisting narratives, gaslighting with the precision of someone who had done it all his life. But I didn't shrink or fold like he expected. I kept my arms relaxed. My face calm. My breathing steady. And that calmness unsettled him more than any anger could. In a last attempt to regain control, he grabbed my wrist, hard enough that his fingers left visible marks. Normally, I would have pulled away, apologized, maybe even blamed myself. But not this time. I leaned in just slightly and whispered, if you don't let go, I will scream loud enough to wake the entire estate. My voice didn't tremble. My eyes didn't water. And that terrified him. He dropped my hand instantly, as though he had touched fire. Because he finally realized something that pierced straight through his ego. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. The mansion turned chaotic after that, not visibly, but internally. He started making frantic phone calls in a separate room, speaking in hushed, rushed tones. I could hear bits and pieces: contain this, damage control, public image, don't let anything leak. He barked orders at the staff, who scrambled like they were used to being treated as disposable. He kept pacing, dialing, texting. His empire wasn't crumbling yet, but the foundation had begun to tremble. And he felt it. While he spiraled, I observed. Quietly. Calmly. Strategically. I watched how he double-checked the security system. How he deleted messages from his phone. How he locked drawers and changed passwords. Each behavior was a confession. Each fear of his was a weapon for me. He didn't know what I had discovered, and that uncertainty was eating him alive. He was unraveling from the inside, and he was doing it publicly, visibly, messily. Then, as if the universe wanted to amplify the tension, his mother arrived unannounced. She swept into the mansion with the elegance of royalty and the emotional warmth of an icicle. She didn't greet me. She didn't acknowledge me as her daughter-in-law. She walked straight past like I was a decorative piece she never approved of. Her perfume lingered in the air like poison as she approached him, and the moment she whispered into his ear, his entire body stiffened. He went pale. His lips parted slightly. His eyes flickered toward me with a mixture of panic and accusation. I didn't know what she told him, but I knew it wasn't good. And I knew it was about me. When he walked away, she turned to me with the kind of smile you'd expect from someone who has already planned your funeral. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't curse. She used polished, aristocratic cruelty, the kind that sounds like advice but feels like suffocation. She told me I needed to stop provoking him. That I had a responsibility to support his mental state. That I should remember my place and understand why this marriage was necessary. Her words were daggers wrapped in silk. But I didn't bend. I didn't play the obedient wife. I simply smiled and said softly, "You should ask your son what he's hiding. I'm not the cause of his downfall, but I might be the witness." For the first time, her expression faltered. Just a flicker. Just enough for me to know I had struck a nerve. In that moment, I realized the full truth. I wasn't just up against a controlling husband. I was up against an entire dynasty of manipulation and obsession. A family desperate to protect a name built on secrets. But what they didn't know was the most dangerous part. I had already seen the cracks. And I planned to widen them. The afternoon passed in slow, tense waves. The mansion felt like a pressure cooker, each room holding its breath. The staff whispered behind doors. His mother watched me like a hawk. He avoided my eyes completely, terrified he might see the truth reflected back at him. And I moved through the house like a ghost who finally realized her own power. But everything, absolutely everything, changed later that night. Because that was the night I caught him doing something that confirmed his deepest fear. He no longer had control. And I was no longer the girl he married. That night, the mansion felt different in a way I couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the silence, thick, suffocating, too perfect to be natural, or maybe it was the faint tension in the air, like even the walls were waiting for something to happen. The chandeliers were dimmed lower than usual, casting long shadows across the floors that twisted and stretched like living things. The corridors seemed narrower. The rooms felt colder. And every sound, a distant door closing, the soft click of glass on marble, seemed amplified, like the house itself was holding its breath. I couldn't sleep, not with everything swirling inside my head. His silent panic throughout the day. His mother's veiled threats. The secrets I had uncovered. The way he kept checking his phone, locking his office, double-bolting cabinets he never cared about before. He was hiding something new. Something bigger. And that terrified him even more than the truth I already knew. So instead of lying in bed like an obedient wife waiting for her controlling husband to calm down, I slipped out of the room and let the mansion guide me like a labyrinth that wanted to show me its darkest corner. The deeper I walked into the hallways, the more I noticed the shifts, staff were missing, doors that were usually open were shut tight, and there was an unusual number of footsteps echoing up from the lower levels of the house. Not chaotic footsteps, not rushed ones, but quiet, intentional, almost secretive. Then I heard it, the faint murmur of voices coming from his office. Not one voice. Not two. At least 4 or 5. Serious, low, tense. I crept closer, each step soft but deliberate. The door was cracked open just an inch, and through that small gap, I could see him standing around the large table with men I had never seen before. Their suits were too sharp, their posture too rigid, their presence too dominant to be ordinary business partners. The atmosphere around them was thick with urgency, the kind of urgency that meant trouble. They spoke in hushed tones, but every word they uttered felt heavy, like each sentence carried consequences that could crush a kingdom. Papers were scattered across the table. Red folders. Sealed envelopes. Stamped documents. And something else, something that made my stomach twist, a tablet displaying charts, numbers, and transactions that didn't match anything I had seen in his regular business documents. He looked exhausted in a way I had never seen before, not physically tired, but mentally cornered. His jaw was clenched, his hair was disheveled, and he kept rubbing the bridge of his nose like he was trying to erase reality. One of the men leaned in and whispered something urgent. Another slapped a document onto the table with frustration. My husband snapped back at them, losing his composure entirely, shouting in a tone that I had never heard leave his mouth unless he wanted to intimidate me. Now, he was the one being cornered. He wasn't the predator tonight. He was prey. Another man stepped forward and spoke louder. If this leaks, everything collapses. Your name, your company, your inheritance, everything. You need to get control of your house before she becomes a liability. She. They were talking about me. The realization hit me like ice water pouring down my spine. They didn't see me as a wife. They didn't see me as a partner. They saw me as a threat, as a piece in their empire they needed to control or silence. My pulse quickened. For a moment, my instinct screamed at me to run back to my room. To hide. To pretend I saw nothing. But then another thought rose inside me, steady, powerful, a spark of defiance I didn't recognize in myself before this marriage. No. Stay. Watch. Learn. And I did. One man slid a folder across the table and spoke in a softer, deadlier voice. Your marriage was supposed to stabilize your public image. Not make it worse. My stomach twisted. So that was it. I was never a choice. I was never a person to him. I was a solution. A tool. A shield. But their next words shook me even harder. If she talks, everything you built goes down. My husband slammed his fists on the table, shouting that he had everything under control. But he didn't. He knew it. They knew it. I knew it. His empire was cracking, not because of me, but because of the truth he built it on. And they were terrified that I had discovered even a piece of it. His panic wasn't about losing me. His panic was about losing everything he pretended to be. Suddenly, one of the men lowered his voice and said something that made my entire body go cold. If she becomes a problem, remove the problem. Remove the problem. I stepped back instinctively, my breath catching in my throat. The floor seemed to tilt slightly beneath my feet. My fingers trembled, but not with fear, with clarity. They weren't talking about separation. They weren't talking about divorce. They were talking about silencing me permanently if needed. In their world, a wife wasn't a human being, she was a risk factor. My husband didn't object. He didn't defend me. He didn't even flinch. He just stared at the documents, silent. And that silence was worse than any threat. Because silence meant consent. Silence meant I was disposable. Silence meant they had already considered the possibility. I slowly backed away from the office door, careful not to make a sound. Every heartbeat felt like a countdown. Every hallway felt like a trap. Every shadow felt alive. When I finally reached my room, I shut the door and leaned against it, trying to stop my body from trembling. Not from fear, from rage. They thought they were planning my fate. They thought I was weak. They thought I was naive enough to stay silent. They didn't know I had already seen the files in his office. They didn't know I had already connected some of the dots. They didn't know I wasn't the same woman he had forced into marriage. And in that moment, in that terrifying, electrifying moment, I made a promise to myself. If they wanted war, I would give them one. And I would make sure I was the last one standing. What none of them knew was the most dangerous truth of all. I wasn't running anymore. I was preparing. The night stretched endlessly, heavy with secrets and unspoken threats. The mansion, which had once felt like a fortress of power, now felt like a cage filled with whispers of lies and betrayal. I couldn't sleep, and the more I thought, the more the pieces of his world started to fall into place in my mind. Every document I had glimpsed, every hushed conversation I had overheard, every subtle flicker of panic in his eyes, they weren't just cracks. They were blueprints for how his empire could fall. And for the first time since he forced me into this marriage, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in months: control. Not over him. Not over the money or the empire yet. But over my own power, my mind, my choices, my strategy. I spent hours pacing my room, replaying the events of the day in my head. His panic. His mother's poison words. The way his business partners had openly acknowledged me as a risk. Each memory was a puzzle piece that, when assembled, revealed a terrifying yet exhilarating truth: I could take him down. And not just hurt him, but dismantle the very world he thought he controlled. I wasn't naive. I knew it wouldn't be easy. He had money, influence, and resources. But so did I now: the knowledge of his secrets, the observation of his weaknesses, and most importantly, the fact that he had underestimated me. That was my leverage. The first step was subtle. I couldn't afford to make mistakes yet. I had to blend in, act like the compliant wife, the fragile trophy he had married, while gathering intelligence. Each day, I observed him, his meetings, his phone calls, his late-night texts. I studied how he manipulated his partners, how he intimidated his employees, and how he tried desperately to maintain a facade of perfection in public. And the more I watched, the more I realized the empire was already unstable. The walls were already crumbling. He just didn't see it because he was too obsessed with appearances. I could see the cracks that no one else noticed. Then came the opportunity. It was small at first, almost insignificant, but I recognized it immediately. Adrian's trusted financial advisor had been careless. A single document left open on the desk. A mistake that revealed a transaction nobody else had seen, a deal he thought hidden. I didn't touch it yet. I only memorized it. I knew the moment I acted, it would have to be precise, calculated, lethal in its effectiveness. One wrong move, and I could end up not just trapped, but destroyed. But I wasn't afraid anymore. Fear had been replaced by determination, anger, and a simmering excitement that felt like fire in my veins. Over the next few days, I played the part of the obedient wife flawlessly. I smiled when he entered the room. I nodded at his instructions. I laughed at the jokes that were meant to belittle me. But inside, I was mapping every move, every weakness, every secret that could bring his carefully constructed world crashing down. His arrogance was my advantage. He had forced me into this marriage thinking I was powerless. He didn't know I had already begun plotting. He didn't know I had already decided that the moment would come when I would no longer hide behind silence. The first act of rebellion was subtle but effective. I leaked a minor discrepancy to one of his investors, something small enough to seem accidental, but significant enough to create doubt. I watched from the sidelines as panic began to ripple through his network. His usually confident demeanor faltered in meetings. He barked orders at staff who didn't know how to respond. He called late into the night, voice low and furious, trying to cover the gaps he hadn't even realized were visible to everyone else. And all the while, I watched, learning, adapting, preparing my next move. The psychological battle had begun. It was no longer just about survival. It was about power. And for the first time, I understood the intoxicating thrill of it. Every small victory, every moment I observed his panic, fueled a fire inside me. I had been forced into this marriage to protect his reputation, to silence me, to make me invisible. But I was awake now. I was aware. And I had a plan, a dangerous, brilliant, unstoppable plan. That night, I sat alone in my room, documents spread out on the floor, notes scribbled across papers like a general preparing for war. My heart pounded with anticipation, not fear. The empire he had built on lies, manipulation, and intimidation could be dismantled piece by piece, and I had already found the first pieces. I whispered to myself, he took everything from me. Now, I will take everything from him. And he won't see it coming. The mansion was silent, but the silence no longer frightened me. It was my ally. Every shadow, every corner, every echo of the walls reminded me of the secrets I held. And deep down, I felt the first stirrings of something that would soon become unstoppable, the thrill of revenge. The knowledge that the empire that had trapped me, humiliated me, and tried to destroy me would soon crumble, and I would be the one standing over the ruins. As I lay back that night, the moonlight streaming through the window, I smiled. Not a gentle smile, not a forgiving smile, a dangerous, calculated smile. Because the first move had been made. And Adrian had no idea that the war had already begun. Days passed like a storm creeping over the horizon. Every morning, I woke in the mansion knowing that the empire I lived inside was no longer untouchable. I moved silently through the halls, observing Adrian as he tried desperately to maintain the illusion of control, while his panic became more transparent with each passing hour. The servants whispered behind closed doors, their eyes darting toward him and then toward me, unsure whether to treat me as a victim or an ally. And yet, I held my silence, letting their curiosity and his paranoia fuel the fire I had already lit. I was no longer the frightened girl he had dragged into this marriage. I was a strategist, calculating, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That opportunity came faster than I expected. A minor investor meeting was scheduled, one Adrian considered routine. He had spent the week meticulously preparing, printing glossy reports, rehearsing speeches, and reminding his assistants to double-check every number. The room was filled with men in crisp suits, their briefcases lined with contracts and projections, a chamber of power, a battlefield disguised as finance. Adrian stood at the head of the table, perfect posture, forced confidence, and that familiar polished smile plastered across his face. He was ready to conquer the room, to reassure his partners, to show them the control he thought he still had. But I had already planted the seeds of chaos. I arrived late, fashionably, as if by coincidence, carrying a portfolio of my own, documents carefully curated from the files I had uncovered in his office. I didn't need to speak yet. I just stood there, letting the weight of my presence be felt. His smile faltered for just a second when our eyes met, the flicker of recognition passing between us like lightning in the air. He had underestimated me from the start, assumed I would remain invisible, powerless, compliant. That error would cost him dearly. The meeting began, and Adrian launched into his presentation, smoothly, rehearsed, confident. But as he clicked through the slides, my portfolio slipped from my hands, intentionally, a calculated accident, spilling papers across the polished floor. I bent down to gather them, making sure a few of the key documents, numbers that didn't align, transactions that should have been impossible, evidence of shady deals, caught the light and the attention of the investors. Their eyes flicked toward the pages, curiosity piqued, suspicion awakening like a coiled snake ready to strike. I could see it in Adrian's expression, the subtle tightening of his jaw, the imperceptible tremor in his hand. His carefully constructed confidence was starting to crack. One investor leaned forward, picking up one of the papers. He whispered something to the man next to him, just loud enough for Adrian to hear. And I watched, fascinated, as Adrian's entire demeanor shifted. Gone was the calm, unshakable CEO. Now he was a man cornered, scrambling to maintain control, barking at assistants, shoving papers into folders, trying to explain away numbers that were impossible to justify. Every attempt made him look weaker, more desperate, and more vulnerable. And I didn't move a muscle. I let the chaos unfold. Then came the moment of pure, electrifying clarity. One of the investors, a sharp-eyed woman who didn't respond to charm or authority, spoke directly to him. "Adrian, this doesn't add up. Are you hiding something?" The room went silent. Every head turned to him, some eyebrows arched in suspicion, some faces frozen in disbelief. Adrian's lips parted, his words faltering, searching for a script that no longer existed. He was exposed, partially, yes, but enough that the walls he had built around his public image were starting to crumble. And he knew it. His eyes flicked to me, panicked, desperate. The message was clear, he could no longer control the narrative. I realized then, fully and completely, how intoxicating this was. Not just the power, but the awakening. For months, he had treated me as a shadow, a tool, a problem to be managed. He had forced me into this marriage thinking I would remain silent, invisible, powerless. But I wasn't. I was awake. I was alive. I was a threat. And in that moment, I became more than a threat, I became the catalyst for his unraveling. The meeting ended in stunned silence. Investors whispered to each other in the hallways. Adrian stormed out, muttering under his breath, his polished mask completely shattered. His assistants followed him, wide-eyed, unsure how to calm a man whose entire life had just begun to slip through his fingers. I stayed behind, casually gathering my documents, letting the weight of the situation settle. That night, Adrian didn't come home at his usual hour. He called frantically, trying to explain, to justify, to contain the fallout. I listened to his voice on the line, sharp, harsh, trembling underneath the surface, and felt a thrill that I hadn't allowed myself in years. For the first time, I felt the sweet taste of control, of knowing that the man who had stolen my life, who had humiliated me, who had forced me into this marriage, was now reacting to me, afraid of me. I sat by the window that night, looking out over the city skyline, moonlight reflecting in the glass, feeling the first wave of empowerment wash over me. The empire that had seemed untouchable just days ago was starting to crack. And the best part? I didn't need to do anything drastic yet. I only needed to exist, to observe, and to let his arrogance, fear, and desperation do the work for me. But I knew this was only the beginning. The first public blow had been dealt. The cracks were showing. And I could see it in the way he would look at me from now on, not as a wife, not as a possession, but as a storm he could no longer predict. A storm he could not stop. And I smiled quietly to myself. Because the war was no longer in the shadows. It had moved into the open. And I had already won the first round. The days that followed the investor meeting were unlike anything I had ever experienced. The mansion, once a symbol of Adrian's control and unshakable power, now felt suffused with a nervous energy, almost like it was alive, aware of the cracks spreading through the empire he had built. Adrian was no longer the polished, untouchable man he had presented to the world. He was raw, jittery, pacing endlessly through the halls, his face taut with frustration, his jaw clenched so tightly I feared it might break. Even his assistants, once terrified of making the smallest mistake, now moved cautiously, unsure how to respond to a man unraveling before their eyes. The very air of the house had shifted. Fear had entered, not mine, but his. Every morning, he woke with a heightened sense of urgency, like a predator sensing a rival nearby. And, in a way, I was that rival. Every glance I gave him, every casual movement I made, every smile I allowed to linger just long enough, reminded him that I was no longer silent. I could see it in the slight quiver of his hands when he signed documents, the brief flicker of panic in his eyes during video calls, the tense way he addressed employees who dared to question him. He had forced me into this marriage to preserve his reputation, to silence me, to make me a pawn. And now, the very tools he thought would hold me captive were turning against him. That afternoon, an unexpected event pushed the tension to a breaking point. A journalist, someone from a national news outlet, appeared at the mansion gate, insisting on an interview about Adrian's latest charitable project. Normally, such visits were orchestrated by him, controlled and predictable. But today, chaos had already set in, and he had no time to arrange anything. When the journalist requested to speak with him, panic flickered across his face like a candle in the wind. He was cornered, unprepared, and he knew it. He glanced at me, desperation in his eyes, silently pleading for compliance, for control, for a lifeline. But I only smiled softly, like someone who knew the truth and wasn't afraid to let it breathe. As the journalist was led inside, I noticed Adrian's gestures becoming more erratic. His usual calm explanations faltered, words tangled in his mouth, sentences broke mid-thought. The interview, meant to be a showcase of authority, became an unintentional exposure of the cracks in his empire. Questions were asked that he hadn't anticipated. Numbers he had manipulated were challenged. And for the first time, he could no longer charm or intimidate his way through a public setting. Later that evening, he confronted me in private, pacing the room like a caged animal, his voice rising and falling with anger and fear. He accused me, subtly at first, of having orchestrated the entire scenario. He asked how I knew about the documents, how I seemed to anticipate the journalist's questions, and why I hadn't warned him. His accusations were pointed, sharp, but I remained calm. I let him vent, watched him spiral further, listened as he revealed more than he intended, weaknesses, fears, insecurities. And in that moment, I realized the truth. This was bigger than him. This wasn't just about control in the marriage anymore. It was about exposure, about dismantling the illusion he had built his life upon. I had become the force that could strip him of his power, not with violence, not with confrontation, but with patience, strategy, and intelligence. That night, I documented everything. Notes on conversations, behaviors, inconsistencies, everything he did to try to cover the cracks he had created himself. Every interaction became ammunition, every misstep a building block for the next phase of my plan. He thought he was still in control, but in reality, the battlefield had shifted. He had been blind to my strength, blind to my observation, blind to my resolve. And now, every move he made, every lie he told, only tightened the noose around his empire. By the end of the week, the first public whispers of his instability began circulating. Minor investors quietly questioned him, staff became hesitant, and his mother, who had always been his strongest ally, started noticing the cracks that I had strategically exposed. Adrian realized, finally, that the empire he had relied on for protection and identity was vulnerable. And that vulnerability terrified him. I watched him from the shadows, a careful observer, calculating, patient. I didn't need to act rashly. I didn't need to confront him with a dramatic reveal. All I needed was for him to continue exposing himself, step by step, to the world he valued above all else. And every time he stumbled, every time he faltered, every time he tried to regain control and failed, my confidence grew. My fear was gone. My power was growing. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt truly alive, not a victim, not a pawn, but a force that could shape the course of a man's life and everything he had built. And as I looked out across the mansion that night, the city lights glimmering in the distance, I realized the first public blow had been dealt. The empire that had seemed untouchable was starting to crumble. And Adrian? He was powerless to stop it. But this was only the beginning. Because the next moves I had planned would not just expose him, they would destroy him completely. The tension in the mansion had reached a fever pitch. Adrian could feel it, even if he couldn't admit it to anyone, not even to himself. The air seemed thick, heavy with anticipation, like the calm before a storm too powerful to contain. Every step he took, every glance he threw my way, carried a mixture of fear and disbelief. He had spent a lifetime believing he could control everything, his empire, his image, even me, but now, he was beginning to understand a terrifying truth. Control was an illusion, and I had the power to prove it. That night, I decided it was time to confront him, not with anger, not with rage, but with precision, strategy, and the quiet confidence of someone who knows the truth. I waited in the study, papers carefully arranged, every document I had collected laid out like pieces on a chessboard. When he entered, his usual swagger was gone, replaced by hesitation and tension. He glanced at the papers and immediately recognized what was happening, but fear flashed across his eyes like lightning. He tried to mask it, tried to say something clever, tried to regain dominance. But it was too late. The battlefield had shifted, and I was no longer a pawn. I was the player. I spoke softly, deliberately, my words cutting through the silence like a knife. Do you see now, Adrian? This isn't about marriage, isn't about control, isn't about appearances. This is about truth. Your lies, your empire, your manipulation, they're all exposed. His lips parted as if to reply, but I held up my hand, letting him know I was not finished. You forced me into this marriage thinking I was powerless. You thought I would obey, that I would remain silent, that I would never act. But every step you took to control me, every secret you tried to bury, every lie you fed to the world, it's all here. I gestured to the documents spread before us, the evidence of transactions, hidden deals, manipulations, everything. His face went pale. Panic replaced arrogance in an instant. He tried to speak, to explain, to manipulate, but the words failed him. For the first time, I saw the real Adrian, stripped of his charm, stripped of his power, stripped of the facade he had worn for decades. He wasn't just vulnerable, he was terrified. And that fear was intoxicating. I continued, calm but relentless. Do you remember why you married me? To protect your reputation. To hide your mistakes. To silence the one person who might expose you. But you failed. You underestimated me, and now your empire is crumbling because of the very truths you tried to hide. His jaw tightened, his hands trembling slightly. He leaned forward, desperation in his eyes. This isn't over, he whispered, a fragile threat that sounded more like a plea. I smiled faintly, a smile without warmth, but full of conviction. It is over. Not because I said so, but because the world is watching. Every partner, every investor, every person who once admired you, they're seeing the cracks now. And it's too late to hide. Then came the final, devastating move. I reached for my phone and, with deliberate slowness, began sending evidence, financial inconsistencies, confidential emails, proof of secret deals, to journalists, investors, and regulatory authorities. The subtle hum of notification alerts filled the room, each ping a dagger to his ego, each email a confirmation that his control was gone. He lunged forward, trying to stop me, but I was calm, unyielding, untouchable. I had anticipated this moment for weeks, planned every detail meticulously, and nothing he could do would reverse it. He screamed, a sound I had never thought I would hear, raw, unpolished, desperate. He begged, pleaded, threatened, but it was useless. The empire he had built on manipulation, deception, and fear was now exposed to the world. And in that exposure, I found a grim satisfaction. Not vengeance in its cruelest form, but justice, calculated, unstoppable, inevitable. After he collapsed into the chair, exhausted, defeated, and unable to speak, I took a step back and looked at him, truly seeing him for the first time. The man who had forced me into a marriage to protect his reputation was no longer the same. The arrogance that once made him untouchable was gone. The fear, the desperation, the realization of his vulnerability, that was all that remained. And for the first time, I felt the full weight of what I had accomplished. But the final blow, the part that would cement his downfall publicly, was yet to come. This confrontation had shattered him internally, but the world needed to see the cracks. The empire wasn't just crumbling behind closed doors, it had to collapse in the open, for everyone to witness. And that was the next step, the ultimate stage of my plan, the moment where truth would triumph over power, and I would rise not just as a survivor, but as the force that dismantled a dynasty. As I left the study that night, I felt a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. Relief that the first confrontation had gone exactly as planned. Anticipation because the final act, the public exposure, the unraveling of his empire, the moment when Adrian would realize he had lost everything, was only beginning. The war had reached its climax, and I was ready for it. Because in this game, I had learned one irrefutable truth: those who underestimate a woman scorned never survive. The morning broke over the city like a warning. Sunlight streamed through the mansion windows, but it did little to illuminate the darkness that had settled over Adrian's once commanding empire. The weight of reality pressed down on him, heavier than any business deal, stricter than any contract, more unforgiving than the wealth he had spent a lifetime building. For months, he had lived under the illusion that he controlled everything: money, people, appearances, even me. But illusions, I had learned, are fragile. And today, they would shatter completely. The world outside the mansion began to awaken to the cracks I had quietly, meticulously revealed. News outlets picked up on irregularities in his financial reports. Investors who had previously turned blind eyes now questioned transactions, audits were initiated, and whispers spread like wildfire. Social media, always hungry for scandal, erupted. Headlines screamed quietly at first: billionaire's empire faces scrutiny, mystery leaks shake the financial world, high-profile marriage raises questions. Each post, each article, each mention was a hammer striking against the foundation Adrian had worked so hard to make indestructible. Inside the mansion, he paced nervously, phone clutched like a lifeline, eyes darting at every ping and alert. He had always thrived on control, on dominance, on perception. But now, he was powerless. The walls he had built around his life, the careful curation of status, wealth, and influence, were collapsing. And all the while, I watched him, steady, calm, and almost detached. The fear in his eyes was intoxicating. He could never have imagined that the person he tried to silence, the one he thought would bend to his will, would become the architect of his undoing. I approached him slowly, letting my presence be felt like a quiet storm. He froze, that flicker of arrogance that always lingered beneath his panic now replaced with pure terror. What have you done?" His voice trembled, a rare crack in his armor, a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. I smiled, but it was not a smile of cruelty, it was the calm, undeniable satisfaction of someone who had fought back and won. "I did what you underestimated me enough to allow," I said softly. "I exposed your lies, your manipulations, your secrets. And now, the world sees what you hid behind your empire." He tried to argue, to plead, to explain, but the weight of evidence, the inevitability of exposure, and the growing attention from the outside world made his words hollow. For the first time, he was stripped bare, not just in reputation, but in spirit. The empire he had believed invincible was crumbling in real time, and he had no allies left to prop it up. Even his mother, his most loyal defender, could no longer mask the truth. She had watched his panic, the unraveling of his carefully curated life, and for once, she was silent. I didn't need to act further. I didn't need to strike physically or publicly confront him beyond what had already begun. The power was in truth, in revelation, in patience. Every misstep he had made, every secret he had buried, every person he had manipulated, all of it now turned into the instrument of his downfall. And as he realized that, as his empire began to crumble brick by brick, his desperation became almost palpable. He had spent years building walls, masks, and facades, and every one of them fell under the weight of his own deception and my quiet but relentless strategy. Later, he retreated into the mansion, exhausted, defeated, broken in ways that no apology, no manipulation, and no wealth could fix. I watched him from a distance, observing the transformation. The man who had forced me into marriage thinking he was untouchable was now just a shadow, a fragment of arrogance and illusion stripped away. And in that moment, I understood the full scope of my own power. I had survived, I had outmaneuvered, and I had risen. I stepped out onto the balcony, looking at the city lights stretching endlessly before me. The world was vast, full of opportunity, and for the first time, I felt truly free. Free from fear, free from manipulation, free from the chains of a marriage built on lies and control. The empire that had dominated my life, that had sought to silence me, had fallen, and I was standing in its ruins, not just as a survivor, but as someone who had mastered her own destiny. And in that moment, I whispered to myself, quietly, with fierce satisfaction, "You forced me into this marriage to protect your reputation. I gave you nothing to control. And in the end, I rose while your empire crumbled." The war was over. The battle had been long, dark, and exhausting, but the victory was absolute. Adrian's legacy, built on manipulation and fear, had collapsed. The truth had prevailed. And I had emerged, not as a victim, not as a pawn, but as the unstoppable force that changed everything. As I turned away from the balcony, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. My heart, once heavy with fear and resentment, now beat with clarity and purpose. This was not the end of my journey, but a new beginning, a life where I was free to make choices, pursue dreams, and live on my own terms. Adrian had underestimated me. And that mistake had cost him everything. The city below sparkled like a promise, the night sky stretched endlessly, and for the first time in years, I smiled without hesitation, without fear, without compromise. The empire had fallen. I had risen. And nothing, not money, not power, not lies, could ever take that from me.